So we're undergoing a revolution at the moment in terms of vehicles and their ability to be able to sense what's going on around them. And this is creating some really interesting developments. For instance, by 2020, we're expecting to see a very large number of almost completely autonomous vehicles on the road. And so there's some interesting questions about how do you actually get from where we are now to those types of vehicles. And in particular, certainly from our perspective, what is going to be the impact of mapping and location information within the context of these developments. So I think one of the really interesting things is that the technology that's currently being explored to support autonomous vehicles is going to lead to a large amount of communication between vehicles, and in fact that's been referred to as connected vehicles. And a lot of that communication is actually going to be about the location of that vehicle and all of the other vehicles around you. So if you like, you can start to consider the car as a means of mapping the environment around you as it's moving along the road. So not only can it know where it is and all the things that are around it, we're starting to consider the possibility of exchanging that information with all of the other vehicles on the road. So in combination, you can almost build up a real-time map of the entire road network as the vehicle's moving along it. And that starts to create some really interesting opportunities in terms of autonomous vehicles and their ability to move from A to B without any human interaction at all. I think we've already started to see some really interesting transitions in terms of business models around vehicles. And I guess the classic at the moment is Uber. So the whole notion of car sharing. You own a vehicle, you wish to make a bit of extra money, and there's a way of actually doing that now in a way that is considered to be very safe. And in fact, the whole process that Uber's been using ensures that both the driver and the customer have a greater degree of confidence in terms of that transaction. But if you take that business model, which is certainly challenging a whole range of legal and policy areas for governments, and you consider what would that look like in a world where there was autonomous vehicles, well, that really starts to change things. Because if you can imagine Uber without a driver, then we're starting to consider, well, is there really a need for individuals to own vehicles? If you can leave your house in the morning knowing that there's already going to be a car waiting for you to take you somewhere that you know, you can hop in that car knowing that the bill's going to be already organised, it's all electronic transfer, and you get from A to B certainly in no less time than you would ordinarily, without the disadvantages associated with owning a vehicle, the operating costs and housing and so forth. Well, is that a reality? And I think it probably is. But then that flows on to impacting a whole range of other things as well. So let's consider an Uber without a driver, so driverless Uber if you like. What does that mean then for all of those people that live in a city who no longer feel they need to own vehicles? Well, if you don't need to own a vehicle, then there's a question about whether you even need parking spaces. If the vehicles that are being used are only the ones that are moving people around, that never actually have to stop, then there's a whole range of parking spaces that would effectively be very high value property in many instances, which can be used for other purposes. So that's a really interesting aspect to what autonomous vehicles might lead to. But then you also need to consider that within the context of, say, what are the cities of the future? We're moving towards greater urbanisation, and in fact Australia perhaps leads the way in terms of that urbanisation. By 2020 we could be seeing 98% of the world's population living in cities. So is a vehicle even required in the city of the future? And maybe the most complex vehicle that's required to move around the city, particularly smart cities, might be a bicycle. And indeed this notion of a 10-minute city starts to open up the opportunities of how the future cities might work, and indeed what the role of vehicles might be in those future cities.